History is filled with moments where entire groups of people have disappeared under mysterious circumstances. In most cases, some explanation eventually emerges, logical or otherwise, that helps us make sense of what happened. But on rare occasions, the facts defy reason entirely. This is one of those cases, the chilling mystery of the village that vanished.
Welcome to Badtime Stories. Welcome to Badtime Stories 2, where nightmares never sleep.
Like, share, and subscribe to Badtime Stories 2 for more true horror and mystery. Tap the channel now to watch the full video.
Cold wind, distant howling. The sun had barely risen when Joe LaBelle, a seasoned trapper, packed the last of his gear into a small canoe and set off downstream. Though the previous night had been bitterly cold, this November morning was unusually mild, far gentler than many he'd endured during his years hunting in Canada's remote Northwest Territories. This particular expedition had not gone well. Game was scarce, his traps were mostly empty, and his supplies were running dangerously low. Fortunately, Joe knew of a small Inuit settlement along the shores of Lake Anjikuni, a place he had visited before, where the villagers were known to trade food and provisions in exchange for furs. After more than an hour of paddling, he noticed a thin column of dark smoke curling into the pale sky. Relieved, Joe smiled and adjusted his course toward the village. As his canoe scraped against the frozen shoreline, he stepped out and began walking up the familiar path toward the small collection of huts and wooden sheds. At first, the quiet didn't bother him. It was still early in the day. Perhaps the villagers were out hunting. But as he walked deeper into the settlement, the silence grew heavy, unnatural. Every single dwelling he entered was empty. Fires still burned softly in their hearths. Food was laid out, half-prepared, waiting to be cooked, yet not a single person could be found. It was as if every man, woman, and child had vanished into thin air. Uneasy, Joe decided to investigate further. On the outskirts of the village, he found the settlement's sled dogs, all of them dead, starved despite the presence of food nearby. Even more disturbing were the graves, freshly dug open, their contents missing. The sight sent a cold wave of dread through him. As daylight began to fade, Joe wrestled with indecision. He had found no sign of where the villagers went, no tracks in the snow, no clues at all. But one thing was certain: he would not stay there overnight. Quickly, he gathered what food and supplies he could carry and hurried back to his canoe. As he pushed off into the water, he looked back one last time. To his shock, the entire village seemed to shimmer, bathed in a faint blue glow coming from beyond the horizon. Gripping his paddle tightly, Joe began to row faster. He didn't know what caused the eerie light, and he had no desire to find out. All he wanted was distance and the safety of dawn. Music shifts, tense drums, distant wind. Weeks later, in early January 1931, a small detachment of Royal Canadian Mounted Police left their barracks in Manitoba. Their destination, Lake Anjikuni. Their leader, Sergeant J. Nelson, carried a report that had reached their outpost in the form of a strange and fragmented telegram from Joe LaBelle. Its contents were confusing. A village gone, people missing, graves disturbed but serious enough to demand investigation. The Mounties' journey was long and grueling, more than 560 miles across frozen terrain. They traveled by sled through icy winds and blinding snowstorms, until they finally neared the desolate lake where Joe had made his discovery. Before entering the site, Sergeant Nelson ordered his men to make quiet inquiries among nearby trappers and local Inuit groups. He wanted to know if anyone else had seen or heard of what Joe described, because if the story were true, then what they were about to uncover might be one of the strangest disappearances in Canadian history. Music fades. Deep, echoing silence. History is filled with strange disappearances. Entire groups of people vanishing without a trace. In most cases, time offers an explanation, but a few stories remain so baffling, so deeply unsettling, that no theory has ever truly fit. This is one of those stories, the mystery of the village that simply ceased to exist. It was early morning when Joe LaBelle, an experienced trapper, loaded the last of his supplies into his canoe and set off downstream. Though the previous night had been cold, this November morning was mild by the standards of Canada's Northwest Territories. The problem wasn't the cold, it was hunger. LaBelle's expedition had yielded little so far, and he hoped to trade what few furs he had for food at a small Inuit village near Lake Anjikuni, a place he'd visited before. After nearly an hour of paddling, a thin plume of smoke curled up in the distance, a sign of life. Relieved, he smiled, adjusted his course, and soon guided his canoe onto the frozen shoreline. But as he stepped into the settlement, something was wrong. The village was silent. No laughter, no voices, no dogs barking. At first, LaBelle thought the villagers might be out hunting, but the deeper he ventured in, the more he realized every single hut was empty. Fires still burned. Fresh food sat waiting to be cooked. But there wasn't a single soul in sight. Out by the edge of the village, LaBelle made an even more horrifying discovery. The villagers' sled dogs, all dead, apparently from starvation. And then the graves. Every burial site had been dug up, the coffins emptied. The frozen earth was smooth, not clawed or disturbed by animals. Whatever had done this wasn't natural. As daylight began to fade, a growing unease crept over him. LaBelle gathered what food he could and hurried back to his canoe. When he pushed off and looked back one final time, his blood ran cold. The village was glowing with an eerie blue light coming from somewhere beyond the horizon. He paddled faster, desperate to leave that place behind. Weeks later, in January 1931, a detachment of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police set out for Lake Anjikuni to investigate LaBelle's report. The journey was brutal, 560 miles of frozen wilderness. Their leader, Sergeant J. Nelson, was skeptical, but determined to find answers. Along the way, they met a hunter recovering from frostbite in a remote hospital. His name was Sok, an Inuit trapper found half dead in the snow. When questioned, he muttered incoherently about an evil spirit called Tornrark, a being from Inuit legend, said to command storms and feed on souls. The Mounties dismissed it as feverish nonsense and pressed on. Next, they stopped at a nearby Inuit settlement where elders told them of a strange boy, a 10-year-old who had wandered into their camp during a snowstorm 2 months earlier. He hadn't spoken a single word since his arrival, and no one knew where he came from. But it was the account of another trapper, Armand Laurent, that disturbed Nelson the most. Laurent claimed that he and his sons had seen strange blue lights following them in the sky, and once, a massive cylindrical craft that shifted shape before speeding off toward Lake Anjikuni. When the Mounties finally reached the site, they found the settlement exactly as LaBelle had described: silent, empty, frozen in time. Half-cooked meals still clung to the sides of cooking pots. A child's coat lay abandoned mid-repair, needle still threaded. The huskies were dead from starvation, and the graves were empty. Even stranger, the earth around them was perfectly smooth, with no sign of tools or disturbance. Whatever had removed those bodies had done so without leaving a trace. After hours of searching, Nelson ordered his men to leave. His official report claimed there was no evidence of crime, no explanation for why 30 people had simply walked away from their homes, leaving their sleds, their tools, their food, and even their dogs behind. He noted that Joe LaBelle was a relatively new licensed trapper and had since sold his story to a newspaper known for embellishment. But despite the skepticism, Nelson's findings matched LaBelle's almost exactly, and no one could explain what had happened. So what truly occurred that winter night at Lake Anjikuni? Did the villagers flee some unseen danger, disease, raiders, madness, or did something far stranger take them? Reports of glowing blue lights persisted for years after. Some even claimed the Mounties themselves were shadowed by those same lights on their return journey, but were ordered to stay silent. Was this an act of extraterrestrial abduction? Did a vengeful spirit from Inuit legend, the monstrous Tornrark, rise from the tundra to reclaim its land? Or was the village consumed by something we can't yet comprehend, something that waits still beneath the ice? Whatever the truth may be, Lake Anjikuni remains one of the most chilling mysteries in North American history. A village that lived, breathed, and then simply vanished. Over the years, many have suggested that what happened at Lake Anjikuni may not be of this world. That perhaps, just perhaps, the villagers crossed through something far stranger than snow or ice. A fracture in reality itself. Throughout history, countless ships and aircraft have vanished without a trace. Some believe they slipped through weak points between dimensions, moments where the fabric of our world brushes against another. Could the same have happened here, in the frozen wilds of northern Canada? Decades after the story first broke, the legend of the missing Inuit village continues to resurface. Authors, researchers, and skeptics have all sought answers, and each time, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police are asked to comment. They issue the same reply, that no crime was committed, and that the tale was either an exaggeration or perhaps even a carefully staged hoax. There is, admittedly, evidence to support this theory. Since the original 1930 newspaper article, the details have shifted and evolved. In some versions, the number of disturbed graves is different. In others, the huts Joe LaBelle described become tents, suggesting that what he stumbled upon might not have been a village at all, but rather a temporary hunting camp, its occupants having simply moved on to a new location. If that were true, it would explain much. And yet, the story refuses to die. Even if Joe LaBelle did embellish his encounter, even if parts of it were staged in hopes of selling a tale to the press, the mystery still lingers. Unsatisfied, soft-rising ambience. Too much time has passed for any definitive answer. Whatever happened at Lake Anjikuni is now buried beneath layers of snow, silence, and time. No new evidence will likely ever emerge, and so the truth, whatever it may be, remains lost in the frozen wilderness. Perhaps the villagers simply left. Perhaps something took them, or perhaps they walked through a doorway that was never meant to be opened. Music fades to silence. In the end, the village that vanished remains just that, a story caught between fact and folklore, forever echoing through the cold winds of the Canadian North.
Like, share, and subscribe to Badtime Stories 2 for more true horror and mystery. Tap the channel now to watch the full video.